The morning air in San Antonio, Texas, carried that particular kind of heat that only late August could deliver. Thick, relentless, and unforgiving. The kind that made the asphalt shimmer in waves and turned every breath into something you had to work for. The sky was a flat, bleached blue, cloudless and indifferent, stretched wide over the city like a canvas someone had forgotten to paint properly. Chad Holloway stepped out of his second-hand 1989 Ford Ranger at 7:42 in the morning, already sweating through the collar of his button-down shirt. He was 26 years old, with the kind of face that people trusted immediately, open, earnest, with green eyes that always seemed slightly too wide, like he was perpetually surprised by the world around him. His dark brown hair was combed back with more care than usual, and he'd ironed his khaki pants the night before, which was something he almost never did. He stood in the parking lot of KSAT Country 97, 3FM, and looked up at the building, a squat, one-story structure covered in beige stucco, with a satellite dish on the roof and a hand-painted mural of a cowboy on horseback that had been fading for at least a decade. It wasn't much to look at, but to Chad, that building was everything. He'd been working at KSAT for 2 years, starting as a production assistant who essentially fetched coffee and edited audio clips until his eyes blurred. Slowly, painfully, he'd worked his way into a part-time hosting slot on Saturday mornings. 3 hours of country music and local news that nobody much listened to, except retired farmers and insomniacs. But he was there. He was on the air. And that, he kept reminding himself, was more than most people ever got. He pushed through the glass front door into the mercifully air-conditioned lobby, nodding at Beverly Crane, the receptionist who had worked at the station since before Chad was born. Beverly was 63, wore reading glasses on a beaded chain round her neck, and had the particular gift of knowing everything that happened inside that building before it actually happened. "Morning, Chad," she said without looking up from her crossword puzzle. "Diane wants you in her office, right now." Chad felt his stomach tighten. "It's good morning to you too, Beverly. Did she say what it's about?" Beverly finally looked up. There was something in her expression, not quite pity, not quite warning, but somewhere uncomfortably between the two. "She did not," she said carefully, "but she's been here since 6. Diane Kowalski arriving at 6 in the morning was not a good sign. Diane Kowalski was the programming director of KSAT, and she operated on a philosophy that Chad had spent 2 years trying to fully understand. Radio was not about music, it was not about community, and it was certainly not about art. Radio was about numbers, ratings, advertisers, revenue. Everything else was decoration. She was 47 years old, originally from Chicago, and had the sharp, clipped manner of someone who had clawed their way up through a male-dominated industry by being twice as hard and half as sentimental as everyone else. She wore her dark hair pulled back severely, favored blazers even in the San Antonio summer, and had a habit of tapping her pen against her desk when she was thinking, a rapid, rhythmic clicking that her staff had learned to interpret like Morse code. Fast tapping meant she was irritated. Slow tapping meant she was scheming. No tapping at all was when you really needed to worry. Chad knocked on her office door and waited. "In," she said. Her office was cold. She kept a personal fan aimed directly at her desk regardless of the season, and immaculately organized. A large whiteboard on one wall was covered in numbers, show names, time slots, and arrows connecting them in ways that only made sense to her. Behind her desk, the window looked out onto the parking lot, and the morning sun was hitting it at an angle that made the whole room feel slightly interrogative, like a scene from a police procedural. Diane was on the phone when Chad entered. She held up one finger without looking at him, and continued her conversation. "I don't care what Clear Channel is doing in Dallas. I care what we're doing in San Antonio. Our Thursday afternoon numbers are a disaster, and you know it." She paused, listening, "Then fix it. That's what I pay you for." She hung up and turned to Chad for the first time. "Sit down." He sat in the chair across from her desk, a deliberately uncomfortable chair he'd always suspected, chosen to keep meetings short. "Do you know who George Strait is?" she asked. Chad blinked. "Of course. He's George Strait." "That's not an answer. He's the biggest name in country music. Possibly ever. Ace in the hole, unwound oceanfront property. He's from Pate, Texas. He's been recording since the late 70s. He's basically country music royalty." Diane nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she already suspected. "He's doing a press run for his new album. His people have been reaching out to stations across Texas for radio spots." She picked up a sheet of paper from her desk and studied it with the expression of someone calculating odds. "We've been offered an interview slot. 30 minutes, live on air, this Friday afternoon." Chad felt something shift in his chest, a warm, electric sensation that he recognized as genuine excitement. George Strait, live, on his microphone. This was the kind of opportunity that didn't come to small stations like KSAT. This was the kind of thing that could change everything. "That's incredible," he said. "It could be," Diane said, and her tone immediately deflated the warmth in his chest. "Or it could be just another soft promotional interview that nobody remembers by Saturday morning. George Strait does these things all the time, Chad. He's polished, he's professional. He gives the same answers in the same order with the same smile. You ask him about the album, he tells you it's his best work yet. You ask him about touring, he says he loves his fans. You ask him about Texas, he talks about his ranch. It's predictable. It's forgettable." She set the paper down. "And forgettable doesn't get us ratings." The pen tapping started, slow, deliberate. "What I need," Diane continued, leaning slightly forward, "is memorable. I need something that people talk about Monday morning. I need something that other stations pick up, that maybe gets mentioned on TV, that makes people remember that KSAT is where things actually happen." She looked at him directly. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" Chad understood the words. He wasn't yet sure he understood the implication. "You want me to push him? Ask hard questions. I want you to make him uncomfortable," Diane said flatly. "Not aggressive. We're not doing a takedown piece. But funny. Edgy. I want you to ask the questions nobody asks. The embarrassing stuff, the rumors, the absurd things. I want George Strait to not know what's coming next. I want him off balance. I want our listeners laughing, gasping, leaning forward in their cars." She paused. "I want a moment." Chad was quiet for a moment. Through the window behind Diane, he could see a mockingbird land on the hood of someone's car in the parking lot. Look around with that particular nervous energy mockingbirds always carried, and then fly away. "George Strait is a very private person," Chad said carefully. "His people are going to have ground rules." "His people," Diane said, cutting him off with a precision that suggested she'd anticipated this objection, "have been told this is a standard promotional interview. Standard format, 30 minutes, focused on the new album." She let that sit for a moment. What happens on air is what happens on air. Chad felt the first real unease settle in. "Diane, if we bait and switch George Strait, I'm not asking you to bait and switch anyone," she said with a smile that was almost convincing. "I'm asking you to be creative, to be a real broadcaster, to not just read from a script like every other station in this market." The pen tapping stopped entirely. "This Friday, Chad, we're going to have the biggest name in country music sitting in our studio. What you do with that opportunity will determine whether this station remembers you as the guy who finally delivered something significant, or the kid who had his one shot and played it safe." She opened a folder on her desk, which was apparently his cue to understand that the meeting was concluding. "I'll have research pull everything they can find on him. The weird stuff, the old rumors, the tabloid angles. You'll have it by Wednesday. Study it." She looked up one final time. "Don't waste this, Chad." He walked out of her office with his stomach a complicated place. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of ordinary tasks, editing a commercial for a local boot store, screening calls for the midday show, refilling the coffee maker in the break room. But Chad moved through all of it with his mind somewhere else, turning Diane's words over and over like a stone he couldn't quite set down. He ate his lunch, a turkey sandwich from the gas station 2 blocks over, at the small table in the break room, alone, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sound of the on-air broadcast filtering through the walls. The door opened and Bobby Reyes walked in. Bobby was the station's senior producer, 34 years old, with a thick mustache and the permanently calm demeanor of a man who had survived enough broadcast emergencies to stop being alarmed by anything. He was from Laredo, originally the son of a mechanic and a school teacher, and he had a particular gift for reading a room that Chad had always envied. "You talked to Diane," Bobby said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah." Bobby poured himself a coffee, leaned against the counter, and looked at Chad the way a doctor looks at an x-ray. "George Strait interview." "Yeah. And she told you to make it interesting." Chad looked at him. "How do you know all this already?" Bobby shrugged. "I've been here 9 years, Chad. There are maybe 6 types of meetings Diane has, and I know all of them by the way people walk out of her office." He sipped his coffee. "What exactly did she ask you to do?" Chad told him. He laid it out plainly. The research packet, the embarrassing angles, the goal of putting George Strait off balance, the idea of creating a moment that would generate buzz. Bobby listened without interrupting, his expression not changing much, which Chad had learned could mean many things. When Chad finished, Bobby was quiet for a moment. He set his coffee cup down on the counter. "You know what kind of man George Strait is?" Bobby said finally. "Country music legend, private, from a ranching family." "I don't mean his bio," Bobby said. "I mean what kind of man he is. My uncle grew up in Poteet, same town where Strait is from. I've heard stories about him my whole life, not the record label stuff, not the Rolling Stone profiles. Real stories, from people who know him." Bobby paused. "He's the kind of man who, if you disrespect him, doesn't yell, doesn't make a scene. He just responds in a way that makes you feel exactly what you deserve to feel." Bobby picked up his coffee again, and everybody in the room remembers it forever. Chad absorbed this. "Diane's not giving me much of a choice here." "There's always a choice," Bobby said. "It just doesn't always feel like one." He headed for the door, then stopped and looked back. "For what it's worth, Chad, I think you're a genuinely good broadcaster. You've got instincts, real ones. Don't let her turn you into a stunt." He paused at the door. "But I also think you already know that." He left. Chad sat with his sandwich and the hum of the fluorescent lights and the weight of Friday afternoon hanging over him like a weather system that hadn't quite arrived yet. By Wednesday, the research packet was on his desk. It was 12 pages long, assembled by the station's 22-year-old research assistant, Kevin Marsh, who had the particular enthusiasm of someone who didn't yet understand the damage that information could do. The packet included rumored disputes with record label executives, old tabloid items about George Strait's personal life that had never been confirmed by anyone credible, a list of questions described as uncomfortable but deniable, and a section Kevin had titled, with apparent pride, "Things He Never Talks About." Chad read all of it twice. Then he put it face down on his desk and looked at the ceiling for a long time. He thought about the first George Strait song he'd ever really heard. He was 10 years old, riding in his father's pickup truck on a Saturday morning somewhere outside of Kerrville, and the chair came on the radio. His father, a quiet man who rarely spoke about anything that mattered, had turned the volume up without saying a word, and they'd driven the rest of the way in silence with that song filling the cab. Chad hadn't understood all of it at the time, but he'd understood that it was true, that whoever was singing it meant every single word. He picked the research packet back up, put it in his desk drawer, and closed it. Then he opened his notepad and started writing real questions. Thursday afternoon, Chad was in the production booth running through the technical setup for Friday's interview when his phone rang. An unfamiliar number with the San Antonio area code. "This is Chad Holloway." "Mr. Holloway." The voice was measured, professional, with a hint of a southern drawl that had been smoothed down by years in the music industry. "My name is Richard Calloway. I'm with the George Strait management team. I'm calling to confirm tomorrow's interview and go over a few logistics. Of course, Chad said, sitting up straighter. Mr. Strait will arrive at 2:15 for a 2:30 start. He'll have his publicist, Patricia Dunmore, with him. The interview is 30 minutes, as agreed, focused primarily on the new album and the upcoming tour dates. A brief pause. I want to confirm that your station is aware of the standard protocol for this kind of appearance. We're not doing a gotcha piece. We're not doing tabloid territory. This is a promotional interview. Professional, respectful, straightforward. Absolutely, Chad said, and he meant it. There was a half-second pause on the other end of the line, brief enough that Chad almost missed it. Good. We appreciate that. Mr. Strait is looking forward to it. Another pause. He actually specifically asked which host would be conducting the interview. When we told him it was Chad Holloway, he said he wasn't familiar with the name, but he appreciated that we'd chosen a local broadcaster. Chad wasn't sure why that detail, that George Strait had asked who the interviewer was, settled into his chest the way it did. But it did. Tell him I'll do my best to make it worth his time, Chad said. I'll pass that along, Richard Calloway said, and hung up. Chad sat in the production booth for a long moment after, the phone still in his hand. Then he opened his desk drawer, took out the research packet, walked to the shredder in the hallway, and fed it through page by page. He watched the strips of paper fall into the bin and felt for the first time all week like himself. What he didn't know, couldn't know yet, was that none of it would matter, because by Friday afternoon the situation would be completely out of his hands. The morning of the interview, Chad arrived at the station at 7, 2 hours earlier than usual. He sat at his desk with a legal pad and went through his questions one more time. Real questions, the kind he actually wanted answers to. Questions about songwriting, about the specific kind of Texas landscape that showed up in Strait's music, about what it felt like to watch country music change around you while you stayed true to something older and quieter. Questions about the new album that showed he'd actually listened to it all the way through, twice the night before, with the lights low and a glass of water on the nightstand. They were good questions. He knew they were good. Bobby Reyes had looked them over that morning and nodded in that slow, considered way he had. These are real questions, Bobby said. That's the idea, Chad replied. Diane's going to be disappointed. Diane's going to be in the building, isn't she? She'll be in the control room the whole time, Bobby confirmed. With Kevin, probably. Monitoring. Chad had expected this. Then she'll hear a good interview. Bobby looked at him for a long moment. Yeah, he said finally, she will. He handed the legal pad back. For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. Ask me again at 2:30. By 1 o'clock, the station had taken on a different energy, the particular low-level buzz that descends on a workplace when something significant is about to happen. The receptionist, Beverly, had put on fresh coffee and changed into a nicer blouse. The afternoon DJ, a laconic man named Pete Dunbar, who had been broadcasting in San Antonio for 15 years, stopped by Chad's desk to tell him, with characteristic brevity, "Don't screw it up." Kevin Marsh was vibrating with a nervous excitement that made Chad want to send him home. At 1:30, Diane came to find Chad. She was carrying a folder, and her expression was the precise, controlled kind that people wear when they've decided something and are communicating it without quite saying it. "Let me see the questions," she said. Chad handed her the legal pad. He watched her read. Her pen, she always had a pen, tapped twice, slow, then stopped. "These are soft," she said. "They're substantive," Chad said. "They're the kind of questions a real broadcaster asks a real artist. They're the kind of questions every other station in Texas is going to ask." She looked up at him. "I told you what I needed, Chad. And I heard you," he said. He kept his voice even, the way he'd been practicing in his head all morning. "But I also got a call from his management yesterday confirming that this is a standard promotional interview. If I go off script into tabloid territory, they'll shut it down on the spot. We'd lose the interview entirely. 30 minutes of dead air at 2:30 on a Friday." Diane considered this. He could see her running the calculation, the risk of losing the interview entirely against the potential upside of a moment. "They won't shut it down," she said, but there was slightly less certainty in it than usual. "They might," Chad said, "and if they do, that's not a story that helps us. That's a story that makes us look unprofessional." He paused. "Let me do this right, Diane. A genuine interview with George Strait. One where he's actually engaged. Where he talks about things that matter to him. That's still compelling radio. People will listen." Diane tapped her pen twice more. Then she closed the folder. "Fine," she said, "but I'm in the control room. And if there's a moment, any moment, where you have an opening to make it interesting, you take it. Understood?" "Understood," Chad said. She walked away. Chad let out a breath that he'd apparently been holding for several minutes. George Strait arrived at 2:13. Chad was in the hallway when the front door opened and Beverly's voice carried back with an unusual warmth, the kind that people reserve for genuine admiration rather than professional courtesy. Chad turned the corner and there he was. He was 51 years old in 1993, and he looked exactly like what he was, a man from Texas who had spent his life close to the land, close to music, and close to something essential that most people spent their whole lives searching for. He was tall, lean, wearing dark jeans and a pale blue Western shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, a gray felt Stetson in his hand that he'd apparently removed when he came inside out of basic courtesy. He moved through the lobby with the unhurried certainty of a man who had been in 1,000 rooms and treated every one of them the same way. Beside him was Patricia Dunmore, his publicist, a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-40s with red hair and the polished efficiency of someone who managed complicated situations for a living. She was already scanning the room as she walked in, cataloging exits and potential problems, which Chad suspected was simply how she moved through the world. Chad stepped forward and extended his hand. "Mr. Strait, I'm Chad Holloway. Thank you for coming to KSET." George Strait looked at him with clear, dark eyes and shook his hand. His grip was firm and brief, the handshake of a working man. "Appreciate the invite," he said. His voice was exactly what you'd expect, unhurried, genuinely Texan, with a resonance that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than just the throat. "The station you've got here." "We like it," Chad said, and was surprised to find himself meaning it. Patricia Dunmore inserted herself smoothly. "Chad, I'm Patricia Dunmore, Mr. Strait's publicist. I believe you spoke with Richard yesterday. Just a quick reminder of our parameters. We've got 30 minutes, album and tour focused, I understand completely," Chad said. "I've prepared questions I think Mr. Strait will find genuinely interesting. I want this to be a real conversation." Something in Patricia's expression shifted slightly, the professional wariness softened by a fraction. She nodded. They moved toward the studio. As they walked down the hallway, George Strait slowed for just a moment beside a framed photograph on the wall, an old, black-and-white print of the San Antonio River at flood stage, taken sometime in the 1950s. He looked at it for a quiet second. "My grandfather talked about that flood," he said to no one in particular. Chad glanced at the photo, then at Strait. "The 1952 flood?" "Think so." Strait looked at him. "You from San Antonio originally?" "Kerrville," Chad said. A small, genuine smile. "Hill country boy." "Yes, sir." They reached the studio door. Strait put his hand on the doorframe and glanced back at Chad with an expression that was difficult to read. Not unfriendly, but measuring. The look of a man who had been in enough rooms to know when someone was straight with him and when they weren't. "Good questions make good radio," Strait said simply. Then he walked into the studio. Chad followed. And in the control room, separated by glass, Diane Kowalski sat down, crossed her arms, and watched. What happened in the next 27 minutes would be described afterward in many different ways by the people who were present. Beverly Crane, who listened from the lobby with the volume on the break room speaker turned up, would say it was the best radio she'd heard since she started working at the station in 1971. Bobby Reyes, watching from the hallway through the small studio window, would say it was the kind of interview that reminded you why broadcasting mattered. Pete Dunbar, who pretended not to be listening from his own booth, would say nothing, but would later download the audio and keep a copy of it. And Kevin Marsh, sitting beside Diane in the control room, would say afterward that the first 15 minutes were the best 15 minutes of radio he'd ever heard. But Kevin would also remember what happened at minute 16. The interview had been going beautifully. Chad had opened with a question about the title of the new album, what it meant personally to Strait, not what the label's press release said it meant, and Strait had paused for a moment, as if genuinely deciding whether to give the real answer. And then he had. He talked about a specific stretch of highway in southwest Texas that he drove sometimes when he needed to think, and how the album came from that feeling, the particular kind of quiet that lives in the landscape out there. The way the sky changes color at dusk in a way that makes you feel very small and very calm at the same time. He talked about his father, briefly but honestly. He talked about what it meant to make music that lasted. It was extraordinary. Chad could feel it, the quality of the silence in the headphones between questions, the sense of a genuine conversation happening rather than a performance. And then at minute 16, the control room door opened, and Kevin Marsh entered with a note. Diane had written it herself in her precise, sharp handwriting on a torn piece of paper. Kevin slid it under the studio door, a practice used for song requests and traffic alerts, the most mundane possible delivery system for what the note contained. Chad saw it, reached down, and read it. The note said, "Ask him about the Melody McAllister story, Nashville 1987. Make it interesting." Chad knew what the Melody McAllister story was. It had been in the research packet, an unverified, never-published tabloid item about an alleged incident at a Nashville industry party in 1987, involving a woman named Melody McAllister and a dispute that had supposedly ended with Strait walking out. It had never been confirmed by anyone. It had appeared in one gossip column that was subsequently retracted. It was, in every measurable sense, not a real story. But Diane had written it down and sent it into the studio, and now it was in Chad's hand. And George Strait was sitting 3 feet away, adjusting his headphones, and Patricia Dunmore was watching from behind the glass with an expression that suggested she couldn't see the note but could somehow sense it. Chad looked at the note for a long moment. He looked at George Strait. He set the note on the edge of the desk, face down, and asked his next real question. He asked Strait about the way Texas's geography showed up specifically in his lyrics, whether it was conscious or whether it came without trying. Strait thought about this for a moment, then talked about the difference between writing about a place from memory versus writing about it while you were standing in it, and which one produced something true. In the control room, Diane picked up the talkback microphone. Her voice came through the studio speaker, a direct line from control room to host, audible only in Chad's earpiece. "Chad, the note." Chad continued the interview. "Chad," her voice was sharper, "I need you to use the note." He asked Strait about his touring band, the Ace in the Hole Band, which had been with him since the beginning, and what it meant to have that continuity in a business that chewed through musicians constantly. Strait was talking about a fiddle player he'd known since 1976, when Diane came through the earpiece a third time. "Chad Holloway, if you do not ask that question in the next 60 seconds, you are done at this station. I mean that." There was a quality to her voice that made clear she did mean it. Chad had heard that voice before, not directed at him, but at others. It was the voice she used right before she made good on a threat. Chad looked at the on-air light, read, "Live." George Strait talking about a fiddle player and the specific sound of a Texas dance hall on a Saturday night, his voice warm and unhurried in the headphones. He looked at the note, face down on the desk beside him. He thought about his father turning up the volume in that pickup truck outside of Kerrville. He asked Strait about what he hoped the next generation of country artists would take from his music, and whether he worried about what was being lost. Behind the glass, Diane set the talkback microphone down on the desk without a word. Kevin watched her. Bobby Reyes, still in the hallway, watched through the small window. Nobody moved. The interview ran its final 14 minutes without the note. At 3:02, the on-air light went off. The interview was over. Chad took his headphones off slowly. Beside him, George Strait did the same, setting his carefully on the desk rather than leaving them wherever, the way some guests did. There was a quality to the silence in the studio that Chad had rarely experienced, the particular absence of sound that follows something that went well, and that everyone in the room knows went well. "Good interview," Strait said simply. "Thank you for giving real answers," Chad said. They stood from their chairs. Patricia Dunmore came through the studio door first, already on her phone, managing the next thing in the afternoon schedule. "Mr. Strait, we need to leave by 3:15 for the WOAI appearance, Patricia." Strait's voice was quiet, but it stopped her mid-sentence. "Give me a few minutes." Patricia looked at him, then at Chad, then at whatever she saw in her employer's expression. "Of course," she said, and stepped back out, pulling the door partially closed behind her. Strait looked at Chad. There was something different in his expression now that the interview was over. The professional warmth of the on-air conversation had settled into something quieter and more direct. "That note," Strait said. Chad went still. "I couldn't read it from where I was sitting," Strait continued. "But I've done enough interviews to recognize a producer's note. And I've done enough interviews to know when a host is being told to take a turn and decides not to." He paused. "What was it?" Chad considered lying. He considered deflecting. He considered several things. "It was a question I wasn't going to ask," he said. Strait looked at him with those clear, dark eyes. "About what?" "An old tabloid story. Nothing credible." "My programming director wanted a moment." Chad held his gaze. "I wasn't going to do that to you." Strait was quiet for a moment. Then he tilted his head slightly, just barely, a quarter-inch movement that somehow communicated a great deal. "Why not?" he said. "Career-wise, you'd have been safer following her instructions." "'Cause it wasn't true," Jod said. "And because you gave me a real interview. You don't give someone a real interview and then sucker punch them." Strait studied him for another moment. "Your programming director going to fire you?" "Probably," Chad said. He said it with a steadiness that surprised even himself. Something crossed Strait's face, something quiet and warm, like the change in light right before sundown over the hill country. He looked around the studio for a moment, at the equipment, the soundproofing foam on the walls, the framed concert posters, the coffee cup on the console that said KSAT in letters that had been washing out for years. "How long have you been doing radio?" Strait asked. 2 years at this station. Studied broadcasting at UT San Antonio before that. You any good?" "I think I'm getting there," Chad said. Strait nodded slowly. "You asked me in there about what I hoped the next generation of country artists would take from my music." He paused. "You remember what I said? You said you hoped they'd take the honesty. That country music at its best doesn't perform emotion. It just tells the truth about it." "Yeah," another pause. "Same goes for radio." He reached over and picked up his Stetson from where he'd hung it on the back of his chair. He put it on with the ease of a man who'd been wearing one since childhood. "I'm going to ask Patricia to make a call before I leave today," he said. Chad waited. "I've got a friend at KTR in Houston," Strait continued. "Big station. Good station. They've been looking for a new afternoon host for 3 months." He settled the hat on his head and looked at Chad with an expression of complete, uncomplicated directness. "I'm not making you any promises. The decision isn't mine to make. But I'm going to tell him I sat across from a broadcaster this afternoon who I think knows what he's doing." He paused. "If that matters to you." Chad was quiet for a moment. The studio hummed faintly around them, the residual electricity of the equipment, the air conditioning, the low persistent sound of a building doing its work. "It matters to me," Chad said. "Thank you." Strait extended his hand. Chad shook it, firm and brief, the same as the first time. "Good radio," Strait said again. And then he was gone through the studio door. And a moment later, Chad could hear Patricia Dunmore's voice in the hallway resuming her organizational efficiency. And the sound of the front door, and then nothing. Chad stood in the empty studio for a long moment. Then the control room door swung open and Diane Kowalski walked in. She stood in the studio doorway with her arms at her sides, not crossed, which was unusual. The pen was in her right hand, but she wasn't tapping it. Her expression was controlled in the specific way that people control expressions when they're managing something they haven't decided how to classify yet. "That was a clean interview," she said. Her voice was flat, not warm, not cold. A fact being stated. "Yes," Chad said. "You ignored my directive." "Yes." The pen tapped once. Just once. "You know what this means?" "I think so. I'm not running a democracy here, Chad. I run a radio station. When I give a direction, I need my people to follow it. If every host decided on their own what was appropriate, with respect," Chad said, and he kept his voice steady, "what you asked me to do would have ended the interview. His publicist would have shut it down on the spot. We'd have had 30 minutes of dead air and a reputation for ambushing artists who come here in good faith." He paused. "What we have instead is a 30-minute interview with George Strait that every station in Texas is going to wish they'd gotten." Diane said nothing. The pen tapped again. "I'm not going to pretend I wasn't insubordinate," Chad continued. "I was. And if that means you're letting me go, I understand that." He paused. "But I think you got better radio than you asked for." The silence in the studio lasted perhaps 10 seconds. It felt longer. "Go home," Diane said finally. "I'll call you Monday." She left. The door swung shut behind her. Chad stood alone in the studio with the hum of the equipment and the memory of George Strait, talking about a stretch of highway in southwest Texas where the sky went orange at dusk and made you feel very small and very calm. He put on his jacket. He turned off the studio lights. He walked out. The call from KTRH in Houston came Tuesday morning. Chad had spent the weekend in a state of suspended uncertainty, not exactly afraid, but not exactly calm either. He'd taken long drives the way he did when something was working itself out in him. He'd listened to country radio. He'd called his father Sunday evening. A conversation that touched on many things without touching on any of them directly, the way conversations with his father usually went. Diane had not called Monday. He was making coffee in his kitchen when his phone rang. Houston area code. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Frank Whitfield, afternoon program director at KTRH, who had a direct, business-like manner and the voice of a man who had been in radio his whole adult life and didn't waste much time. He said he'd heard from a mutual acquaintance about Chad's work. He said he'd been given a recording of Friday's interview. He said he'd listened to it 3 times. "I want to be straight with you," Frank said. "We've been looking at several candidates, but whoever called me about you was pretty direct about what kind of broadcaster you are. Said you knew the difference between making good radio and making noise." A pause. "We're interested in talking, if you're interested in listening." Chad looked out his kitchen window at the August morning, the flat blue sky, the heat already building, the particular quality of light that belonged entirely to Texas. "I'm interested in listening," he said. The call from Frank Whitfield was the first piece of good news Chad had received since Friday afternoon, but it arrived in the complicated company of everything else. He still had a job at KSAT technically. Diane hadn't fired him. Her Monday silence had extended through Tuesday without explanation, and by Wednesday morning, he arrived at the station to find everything exactly as it had been before, which was somehow more unsettling than a clean termination would have been. Beverly greeted him at reception the same way she always did. His desk was where he'd left it. His Saturday morning slot was still on the schedule, but the atmosphere in the building had shifted in the subtle, pervasive way that atmospheres shift in small organizations when something has happened that everyone knows about and nobody is discussing openly. Kevin Marsh avoided his eyes in the hallway. The afternoon DJ Pete Dunbar, who normally had nothing to say about anything, said nothing with a particular emphasis. And Diane herself was present in the building, but had not spoken to Chad directly since Saturday afternoon's single conversation. Bobby Reyes found him Thursday morning in the parking lot before the start of the shift. "She's been on the phone with the station ownership," Bobby said without preamble, falling into step beside Chad as they walked toward the entrance. "2 calls Tuesday, 1 yesterday morning. I don't know what she's saying, but I know she's saying something." Chad absorbed this. "You think she's building a case?" "I think she's figuring out what story to tell," Bobby said. "Whether that story ends with you staying or going depends on which version protects her better." He paused. "For what it's worth, the interview has been getting attention. WOA, I mentioned it on their morning show Wednesday. Said Cassat got an unexpectedly substantive segment with Strait." He glanced at Chad. "That's the kind of thing ownership notices. Or it's the kind of thing that makes Diane look like she planned it all along," Chad said. Bobby gave him a look that confirmed this was exactly the kind of thing that had occurred to him too. "You've got the Houston thing," Bobby said. "I've got a conversation scheduled for next week," Chad corrected. "That's all. Still," Bobby held the door open. "Keep it close," the week continued. Chad did his Saturday morning show, 3 hours, alone. Country music and local weather, and the particular quality of early morning radio that had always felt to him like the truest version of the medium. Fewer listeners, less pressure, just the music and the voice and the town coming awake slowly around it. He thought about Strait's words during the interview, the ones about that stretch of Southwest Texas highway, about the way the landscape produced a specific kind of quiet that was different from silence. He thought about what Strait had said after the interview in the studio, about honesty being the same thing in radio as it was in country music. He thought about his father, driving with the volume turned up on a Saturday morning outside of Kerrville. He thought about whether any of it was enough. The following Monday, Diane called him into her office. She was behind her desk. The pen was in her hand, tapping medium speed, which he'd never quite decoded. "Sit down," she said. He sat in the uncomfortable chair. "I've been in conversation with station ownership about the Strait interview," she began. She had the specific manner of someone delivering a prepared statement. "The consensus is that the segment performed well, better than expected in terms of word of mouth and industry response. WOAI's mention generated a measurable bump in our afternoon demographics." She paused. "Which is the goal." "I understand," Chad said. "What it doesn't change," she continued, and her voice shifted slightly, a tightening, a precision, "is the operational issue. You were given a clear directive by your programming director, and you chose not to follow it." She looked at him directly. "That's not a question of whether the outcome was good, Chad. It's a question of whether I can trust my people to execute what I ask them to execute." Chad kept his hands still on the arms of the chair. "I understand the issue. Do you?" She leaned forward slightly. "Because what I need from a host isn't independent judgment about what's ethical. I need execution. I need someone who runs the play I call, not the play they think is better." The pen stopped tapping. "If every host in this building decided on their own moral basis whether to follow direction, I couldn't run a radio station. I'd have chaos." "What you'd have," Chad said quietly, "is a station where nobody ambushes guests." He kept his voice measured. "I understand what you're saying, Diane, and I respect that you have a station to run. But you asked me to ask a man a question based on a retracted tabloid item that was never confirmed by anyone. If his publicist had shut the interview down, which she would have, we'd be having a very different conversation right now." Diane was quiet. The pen stayed still. "You protected yourself," she said finally. Her voice had a quality he hadn't heard from her before. Not warm, not cold, but something almost like acknowledgement. Stripped of the approval that would have made it comfortable. "You made a calculation, and it worked out." She paused. This time, Chad agreed. Another silence. In the parking lot outside her window, a car Chad didn't recognize was pulling in. He watched it for a moment without knowing why. "Your Saturday morning slot is yours until further notice," Diane said. "We won't be giving you additional on-air time for the foreseeable future." She opened a folder on her desk. "That's where we are." She didn't say it was punishment. She didn't need to. "I understand," Chad said. He stood. He was almost at the door when Diane spoke again. "Chad." Her voice was different, quieter. The professional armor dropped by a millimeter. He turned. She was looking at the folder on her desk rather than at him. "For what it's worth, and I mean this professionally, not personally, that was a good interview." She paused. "It was exactly what I would have wanted, if I'd known to want it, instead of what I asked for." Chad looked at her for a moment. "Thank you, Diane," he said. He meant it. And so, he thought, did she? The KTRH meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 2 in the afternoon in Houston. Chad drove the 200 miles in his Ford Ranger with the windows down for the first hour and the air conditioning on for the second, listening to the country station that faded in and out across the hill country. Frank Whitfield's office was on the 4th floor of a building near downtown Houston that smelled of carpet and old coffee, and the particular institutional permanence of a major market. Radio station, a place that had been doing this for decades and expected to keep doing it. Framed gold records on the walls, concert photographs, the distant sound of the afternoon broadcast filtering through the building. Frank was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with gray at his temples and the patient, direct manner of someone who interviewed people for a living and therefore didn't waste time on performances. He shook Chad's hand across a desk covered in organized stacks of paper and audio cassettes, looked at him for a moment the way Bobby Reyes sometimes looked at him, assessing, unhurried, and then said, "Tell me about Friday." So Chad told him. All of it. Diane's directive, the research packet, the note in the studio, the decision not to use it, and the conversation with George Strait afterward. He told it plainly, without making himself the hero of it, because that wasn't how it felt from the inside. From the inside, it had been a series of choices that each felt simple and expensive at the same time. Frank listened without interrupting. When Chad finished, Frank was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you just follow the directive?" Frank asked. "Career-wise, it would have been cleaner. Either way, whether it went well or blew up, you are following orders, not your fault." "Because it would have been my voice asking the question," Chad said. Frank nodded slowly. "Whose idea was it to shred the research packet?" Chad paused. "Mine. Before or after the management call confirming the parameters?" "After," Chad said. "The call made it concrete. But I think I'd already decided." Frank tapped his fingers on his desk once, not Diane's nervous tapping, but the deliberate kind, like someone counting beats. "Here's what I know," he said. "The friend who called me about you is not someone who vouches for people lightly. The recording of the interview is genuinely good, not just competent, genuinely good. And the story you just told me is the kind of story I want running through the head of the person holding a microphone in my afternoon slot." He looked at Chad squarely. "We're prepared to offer you a probationary contract. Monday through Friday, 2 to 6. Afternoon drive. You'd be coming in under current afternoon host Carl Benson, who's transitioning to mornings." Frank named a figure. "It's competitive. We'd want you to start in 6 weeks." Chad looked at the framed gold records on the wall, at the concert photographs, artists he'd grown up listening to, memorialized in glossy black and white, at the window where Houston spread out below them in the midday haze. "I need to go back to San Antonio and settle some things," he said, "but yes, I'm interested." Frank extended his hand across the desk. 6 weeks, he said. They shook on it. Driving back to San Antonio that evening, with the sun going down ahead of him, and the sky doing exactly what the sky does in Texas at dusk, colors that shouldn't exist in nature, happening all at once. Chad thought about what Diane would say when he gave notice. He thought about Beverly and Bobby, and even Pete Dunbar, who communicated everything in negatives and would probably say something like figures and mean it as a compliment. He thought about what it would feel like to be new somewhere, to walk into a building where nobody knew what kind of broadcaster he was yet, where he'd have to prove it all over again from the beginning. He thought about George Strait in the studio, adjusting his headphones with the care of a man who respected the equipment. He turned the radio on. A country station from somewhere east of San Antonio was fading in and out in the static. He turned the volume up until it was clear, and drove the rest of the way home with the music filling the cab, the way his father used to. He gave his notice on a Wednesday morning. He'd typed the resignation letter the night before, kept it brief and professional, and printed it on the single piece of printer paper he kept at home for the rare occasion he needed to print something. He folded it in thirds, put it in an envelope with Diane's name on the front, and set it on the corner of her desk before she arrived, so that she would find it rather than him having to hand it to her. He was at his own desk when she came in at 8:15. Through the wall he heard the particular silence of someone reading something that changes the morning. A few minutes later she appeared in his doorway. She was holding the envelope. Her expression was difficult to read, not the controlled blankness he'd expected, but something slightly more open and slightly harder to name. "Crush," she said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Outside the window behind his desk, a delivery truck was backing into a spot in the parking lot, making that particular measured beeping sound. "Afternoon drive," she said. "Yes." A pause. "That's a good slot." "I think so." She looked at the letter in her hand, then back at him. "How much notice?" 2 weeks. "Or whatever you need. I understand if you'd rather I go sooner. 2 weeks is fine." She folded the letter back into the envelope with the precise, unhurried movements she brought to everything. Then she looked at him, directly, without the professional apparatus, just one person in a doorway looking at another. "For what it's worth," she said, "you were better than this slot." She paused. "I knew that. I just needed you to do what I needed you to do, and you're not built that way." A pause. "Most people who aren't built that way are just difficult. You were good at it. That's rarer." She left before he could respond. He sat at his desk for a moment with the delivery truck still beeping outside, and the fluorescent lights humming, and the smell of Bobby Reyes coffee drifting from the break room. He thought that was probably the most honest thing Diane Kowalski had ever said to him. The 2 weeks passed with the particular quality of time in a place you know you're leaving, heightened and elegiac at the same time, everything both more present and already past. Beverly brought him a slice of cake on his last Friday, chocolate, from the good bakery on Commerce Street, and said, "You're going to do good work in Houston, honey," with an authority that made it feel like a fact rather than a hope. Bobby. Reyes took him to lunch at a Mexican restaurant on his second to last day, a place they'd been to maybe a dozen times over the past 2 years, where the salsa was made fresh every morning and the booths were covered in a red vinyl that had been patched and repatched over the years until the repairs were part of the pattern. "You're going to feel like a rookie again for a while," Bobby said over his enchiladas. "Big market. Different speed. Different everything." He looked at Chad with that considered, unhurried look. "Don't try to sound like them right away. You've got your own sound. Take time to find out where it fits." "How long did it take you to find yours?" Chad asked. Bobby thought about this. "About a year," he said. "And then one morning I just noticed I wasn't trying anymore. It was just happening." He picked up his coffee. "That's when you know." They talked for an hour and a half. About radio, about Texas, about what made a good broadcast and what made a forgettable one, and what the difference actually was when you stripped everything else away. Bobby had theories, Chad had questions. It was the kind of conversation that both men would remember in detail for many years afterward, though neither of them said so at the time. His last day at KSAT, Chad did his Saturday morning show from 6 to 9, 3 hours, alone, exactly as it had always been. He played the records he wanted to play, said the things that seemed true to him, talked to San Antonio in the early morning quiet the way he'd been doing for 2 years. He didn't mention it was his last show. That felt like the right call. At 9 o'clock, He took off his headphones, turned off the equipment, and sat in the empty studio for a few minutes. The on-air light was dark. The building was quiet the way it was on Saturday mornings before anyone else arrived, just the hum of the equipment doing its continuous, purposeful work. He looked at the studio he'd spent the last 2 years learning his craft in. The soundproofing foam, the framed posters, the coffee cup with the worn KSAT logo. The desk where 2 weeks ago a piece of paper had arrived face down and he'd made a choice about it. He thought about George Strait in that chair 3 feet away, talking about a highway in southwest Texas where the sky went orange at dusk, adjusting his headphones with the care of a man who respected the equipment, saying good radio in a tone that made it sound like what it was, a standard worth holding and a compliment worth earning. He stood up. He put his jacket on. He took the coffee cup off the desk and set it carefully in its exact spot and turned off the studio light and went home. 6 weeks later, on a Monday afternoon in October 1993, Chad Holloway sat in the on-air studio of KTRH in Houston, put on his headphones, and looked at the on-air light the way you look at a thing you've been working toward for a long time. The light went red. "Good afternoon, Houston," he said. "You're listening to KTRH. I'm Chad Holloway. It's 2 o'clock, it's a Monday, and it's a beautiful afternoon in Texas. Let's start it right." He pressed play on the first record. The opening guitar of a George Strait song, Easy Come, Easy Go, off the new album, which he'd been listening to since the press copy arrived at the station last week, came through the monitors in the control room and out through the transmitter and across the Houston afternoon to whoever happened to be listening. Frank Whitfield, watching through the glass, gave him a single nod. Chad sat back slightly, closed his eyes for just a moment, and listened to the song. He stayed at KTRH for 11 years. He became what good broadcasters become when they find their place. A voice that people in a city come to associate with a particular time of day, a particular quality of attention, a sense that the person on the other end of the radio is present and honest and worth the time. He won a Regional Broadcasting Award in 1997. He was nominated for 2 more. He turned down several offers from larger markets in other states because Houston was where his sound had taken root, and he didn't see the reason to pull it up. He never worked with Diane Kowalski again. But he heard through the industry that Cossette had a strong few years after his departure, that the George Strait interview had become something of a calling card for the station, held up internally as an example of what quality radio sounded like. He heard later that Diane had left KSAT in 1997 to take a programming director position at a station in Dallas, which was the career move she'd been working toward for years. He was glad for her, in the uncomplicated way you're glad for someone who wanted something specific and got it. Bobby Reyes stayed at KSAT. He became programming director himself in 2001, a fact that seemed to Chad both inevitable and exactly right. They talked on the phone every few months, not about anything in particular, just the way people who worked together in the years when they were becoming themselves tend to stay in touch, because some of what they became happened in the same room, and that creates a specific bond that doesn't require explanation. Beverly Crane retired from KSAT in 2003, after 32 years at the reception desk, and was given a modest party in the break room that Chad heard about from Bobby and wished he'd been there for. In the spring of 2001, KTRH organized a charity event at the Reliance Center, a large country music broadcast fundraiser for families affected by the ongoing drought in South Texas. Chad was the MC. The bill included several major country acts, and one of them at the bottom of the confirmed lineup was George Strait. Chad didn't know until the afternoon of the event that the performances would be briefly introduced by the artists personally before going to a pre-recorded message. He was standing in the wings with a clipboard when he heard footsteps behind him and turned to find George Strait, 59 years old now, in dark jeans and a black Western shirt, looking essentially the same as he had in that San Antonio studio 8 years ago, unhurried, clear-eyed, carrying that quality of stillness that some people are born with and nobody can entirely acquire. He looked at Chad for a moment. San Antonio, he said. Cassette 1993. Chad was genuinely surprised. Yes, sir. Strait's expression carried that same quiet warmth he'd seen in the studio. Not a performance of recognition, but the actual thing. Good interview, he said. I remember every minute of it, Chad said. Me too. Strait glanced at the stage where a technician was adjusting a microphone stand in the amber pre-show light. You ended up in Houston, KTRH. 8 years now. A nod. I heard that worked out. It did, Chad said. Thanks to a phone call someone made. Strait looked at him. That call was easy to make, he said simply. Some things are. They stood there for a moment, the two of them in the wings, with the sound of the growing audience filtering through the curtains and the lights warming up overhead, and the particular energy of an evening that was about to begin. What you did in that studio, Strait said, and his voice had the directness of someone choosing the true thing to say rather than the comfortable one, wasn't about me. I want you to know that. You made a decision about what kind of broadcaster you were going to be. I just happened to be there. He paused. That's yours, not mine. Chad didn't say anything for a moment. Out on the stage, the lights were coming up fully now, and the sound of the audience rose with them. Several thousand people settling in, turning their faces toward the stage, expecting something they hadn't yet heard. I've thought about that afternoon a lot, Chad said finally. More than any other thing in my career, probably. Good, Strait said. That means it was worth something. A stagehand appeared at Strait's elbow. Time to move into position. Strait settled his hat on his head, extended his hand, and Chad shook it the same way he always had. The handshake of two men who had said the true thing to each other and didn't need to say more. Good radio, Strait said, and walked out onto the stage. Later that evening, driving home across Houston with the windows down and the October air, doing the thing October air does in Texas, finally cool, finally forgiving after the long summer, Chad turned on the radio. A country station somewhere in the mid-dial was playing The Chair. He turned up the volume. He drove the rest of the way home with that song filling the cab the way his father used to on Saturday mornings outside of Kerrville, when he was 10 years old and didn't yet understand all of it but understood that it was true, that whoever was singing it meant every single word. Some moments in a career define not what you achieved, but who you became in order to achieve it. For Chad Holloway, the afternoon he put a piece of paper face down on a desk and chose the harder, truer thing was that moment, not because it made him famous, not because it won him awards, but because it made him honest, and honest in radio as in country music is the only thing that lasts.